Jacksonville, Florida, 1995. In the tight-knit, all-black neighborhood of Riverwood, a 9-year-old boy vanished. Police dismissed it as the tragic result of unsolved community violence. For 10 years, as more children disappeared, the official narrative remained the same, ignoring the family's pleas to investigate the reclusive white man who watched them from his window. The cases all went cold. Then, a new pastor, refusing to accept the city's indifference, organized a cleanup of the man's abandoned house. What he found in a locked basement room was not just a collection of horrifying trophies, but irrefutable proof of a predator the system had allowed to hunt in plain sight. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear this. Stories like this, stories that have been deliberately silenced, only get told because you choose to listen. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Your presence here matters. Now, let me tell you the story. When Pastor David Miles arrived in Riverwood in the sweltering August of 2005, he saw a community that was both proud and profoundly wounded. The neighborhood was a small, self-contained world on the north side of Jacksonville, a place of modest but well-kept clapboard houses, ancient oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, and a deep, unshakable sense of identity. His new church, a simple white-steepled building, had served as the community's spiritual and social anchor for nearly a century. He was welcomed with warm smiles and plates of home-cooked food, the generous, open-hearted welcome of a people who had learned, through necessity, to be their own support system. But as the initial warmth of his reception settled into the daily rhythm of his new life, he began to sense a deep, unspoken sorrow that hung in the humid Florida air. It was a ghost that lived in the periphery of conversations, in the sudden, quiet moments that would fall over a joyous church picnic. He saw its physical manifestations everywhere. He saw the small, lovingly maintained memorial tied to a lamppost on the corner of Jackson and Elm, a sun-bleached teddy bear, and a laminated photo of a smiling, gap-toothed boy. He saw the framed school portraits of other children, placed in the front windows of homes, their youthful faces gazing out at a world they were no longer a part of. They were not shrines of remembrance. They were vigils, silent, hopeful beacons against a darkness that had never truly left. He learned the names that went with the faces. Marcus, Tiana, Deshawn. He learned that this was a neighborhood of ghosts, a place where the phrase missing child was not a shocking, singular tragedy, but a familiar, recurring wound. The stories were told to him in hushed tones by the matriarchs of the church, their voices a mixture of grief and a deep, weary anger. They told him of a decade of fear, of a time when the sound of children playing in the street was always tinged with a low, constant hum of anxiety. He came to understand that the wound of Riverwood was not just the loss of its children, but the profound, insulting indifference of the world outside its borders. The police had come, they had taken notes, and they had left, leaving the families with flimsy, insulting explanations and the quiet, crushing weight of their own unanswered questions. Pastor Miles, a man whose faith was rooted in the fierce, unwavering belief in the value of every single soul, felt a profound sense of outrage. He realized that his calling here was not just to offer spiritual comfort for a past that could not be changed, but to seek answers, to demand accountability for a series of injustices that had been allowed to fester like an untreated wound for far too long. He did not yet know the shape of the darkness he was about to confront, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his spirit, that his work in this neighborhood of ghosts had already begun. To understand the depth of Riverwood's wound, Pastor Miles knew he had to understand the official narrative, the story the city had told itself about the neighborhood's lost children. He spent his evenings in the church office, the slow, rhythmic creak of the ceiling fan a lonely counterpoint to the silence, as he scrolled through a decade's worth of local news archives on the library's microfilm reader. What he found was not just a pattern of absence, but a clear, undeniable pattern of systemic neglect, a story of a city that had blamed a community for its own victimization. The first ghost file belonged to Marcus, the 9-year-old with the gap-toothed smile. His disappearance in the summer of 1995 was a 2-day story in the city paper. The initial report detailed a mother's frantic call, a neighborhood search, the discovery of his abandoned bicycle by the creek. The follow-up story, published just a day later, quoted an unnamed police source who suggested the boy's disappearance was likely the result of a criminal element known to the community. The case was never officially solved, but the narrative was set. It was an internal problem, a tragic but unsurprising consequence of life in a troubled neighborhood. The investigation, for all intents and purposes, ended there. 2 years later, when 12-year-old Tiana vanished, the pattern repeated itself, but with a new, more insidious twist. The official police theory, leaked to a local reporter, was that her disappearance was connected to ongoing tensions within the neighborhood. They had no evidence, no suspects, but the implication was clear. The threat was coming from inside. The police department issued a statement calling for community cooperation in solving the case, subtly shifting the burden of their own failed investigation onto the very people who were living in terror. With each subsequent disappearance, Deshawn in 2002 and 2 others in the years between, the narrative became more entrenched. The disappearances in Riverwood were not treated as the work of a potential serial predator, a threat to the entire city. They were treated as a localized, contained problem, a sad but expected symptom of a high-crime area. The police files, which Pastor Miles later managed to have a sympathetic city councilman unseal for him, were filled with the language of bias. They focused on the family's financial struggles, on old unrelated neighborhood disputes, on anything that would support their preconceived notion that the monster was one of Riverwood's own. This official narrative was a form of gaslighting on a municipal scale. It was a brilliant, cynical strategy that achieved 2 goals simultaneously. First, it absolved the police department of the need to conduct a real, resource-intensive investigation. Second, it contained the fear, preventing the story of a potential child abductor from spreading to the city's more affluent and whiter neighborhoods. The children of Riverwood were effectively sacrificed for the city's peace of mind. As Pastor Miles looked at the 5 faded photographs spread across his desk, he saw the devastating result of this decade of neglect. He saw a pattern that was so clear, so obvious, that the only way to have missed it was to have chosen not to look. And he knew, with a burning, righteous anger, that the city of Jacksonville had made that choice over and over again. Every story of a haunted place needs a physical heart, a ground zero where the darkness is most concentrated. In Riverwood, that place was the Abramson house. It stood on the northernmost edge of the neighborhood, at the end of a quiet, dead-end street, its backyard dissolving into a thick, untamed stretch of woods and swampland. It was a 2-story, wood-frame house that had once been a respectable, middle-class family home. But for the past decade, it had been a monument to decay. The house was an eyesore, a source of constant, low-level shame for the proud, well-kept neighborhood. Its white paint had peeled away to reveal the bare, graying wood beneath, like skin flaking from old bones. The windows were boarded up with mismatched pieces of plywood, giving it the blind, vacant stare of a skull. And the yard was a riot of unchecked nature, a dense, suffocating jungle of kudzu that seemed to be actively trying to drag the house back into the earth. But the community's relationship with the house was more than just aesthetic displeasure. It was a place of deep, instinctual fear. Children were forbidden from playing near it, a rule that was enforced by every parent, grandparent, and watchful neighbor with an almost religious solemnity. The house was a wound, a physical manifestation of the darkness that had touched their lives. Its owner had been a man as strange and as isolated as the house itself. Arthur Abramson had been the only white resident on his block, a fact that in itself was not a cause for suspicion, but his behavior had been. He was a reclusive, wraith-like figure who had inherited the house from his parents and had lived there in a state of self-imposed isolation. Neighbors who had lived on the street for 30 years could count on one hand the number of times they had actually spoken to him. He was a ghost, a man who existed only in fleeting glimpses, a pale face in an upstairs window, a shadowy figure working in his yard at dusk. He had vanished 10 years ago, in 2005. His departure as quiet and as mysterious as his life had been. His car was gone one morning, and he simply never returned. The community, still reeling from the disappearance of the fifth and final child just weeks earlier, had barely registered his absence. He was just another ghost, in a neighborhood already full of them. But now, to Pastor Miles, the timing of Abramson's disappearance was not a coincidence. It was a blaring, screaming clue. A predator had been hunting the children of Riverwood for a decade, and then, at the very moment the last victim was taken, the strange, reclusive man at the edge of the neighborhood had vanished into thin air. The house was not just a symbol of the neighborhood's pain, it was the likely source of it. It stood there, silent and rotting under the relentless Florida sun. Its boarded-up windows like sealed eyelids, its dark, tangled yard a perfect shield for the secrets it was still keeping. Pastor Miles knew that the official records were a dead end, a collection of carefully constructed lies. The truth of what had happened in Riverwood lived in the memories of the people who had been ignored, the ones who had been told their fears were irrelevant. He went to visit Mrs. Loretta, the grandmother of Tiana, a woman whose quiet dignity and profound grief had made a deep impression on him. He came not just as a pastor, but as an investigator, seeking the testimony that had been dismissed a decade ago. He found her on her porch, rocking gently, her Bible open in her lap. He sat with her, and for a long time, they just spoke of Tiana, of her love for books, of her quiet, observant nature. Then, gently, the pastor asked her about the Abramson house. Mrs. Loretta's gentle expression hardened, her eyes taking on a distant, painful focus. "I told them," she said, her voice a low, steady hum of a pain that had been polished over the years into a hard, smooth stone of anger. "The day after my grandbaby disappeared, a detective came. A white man. Didn't even look me in the eye. He wanted to know about Tiana's father, about her friends, about any trouble she might have been in. He was looking for a reason to blame us. To blame her." She paused, her gaze drifting towards the end of the street, in the direction of the decaying, overgrown house. "I told him, 'You're looking in the wrong place.' I told him about the man in that house. Arthur Abramson." Her testimony was chilling, a first-hand account of a community's voice being actively suppressed. "That man was not right in the head, Pastor," she said, her voice dropping. "He would watch the children," Tiana told me herself. She said it was like he had ghost eyes. He would just stand there, in his window, half hidden by the curtain, and he would watch them play for hours. No expression, just watching. It made my grandbaby's skin crawl. She started taking the long way home from the library just to avoid his house. Pastor Miles listened, his heart aching, a cold fury building in his chest. "What did the detective do when you told him?" he asked, his voice quiet. Mrs. Loretta let out a short, bitter, humorless laugh. "He wrote it down in his little notepad. He looked up at me, and he said, and I will never forget these words, 'Ma'am, a lot of people in this neighborhood have disputes with each other. We find the problem is usually someone known to the community.' He didn't even hear what I said. He had already decided the monster was one of us." Her words were the final, damning confirmation. The police hadn't just been negligent. Their investigation had been actively and deliberately misdirected by their own prejudice. They had a credible, specific lead, an eyewitness account of a strange, unsettling man who lived in close proximity to the victims, and they had willfully ignored it, choosing instead to pursue a baseless, offensive theory that the community itself was the source of its own suffering. Mrs. Loretta's testimony was the key, the moment that transformed the case from one of systemic failure to one of profound, racially motivated injustice. The police hadn't just failed to protect the children of Riverwood, they had, through their own willful blindness, protected the man who was hunting them. The conversation with Mrs. Loretta was a turning point for Pastor Miles. The problem was no longer an abstract, historical injustice. It was a clear and present wound, a physical place that was a constant, painful reminder of the community's silenced grief and the city's profound neglect. The Abramson house was more than just an eyesore. It was a monument to their invisibility, and Pastor Miles decided, with a conviction that felt divinely inspired, that it was time to tear that monument down, or at least to clean it up. He knew he couldn't do it alone. The house was not just his problem to solve, it was the community's burden to lift. He stood before his congregation the following Sunday, his voice ringing with a passion that was both a pastor's call to faith and a community organizer's call to action. He did not speak of his suspicions, of the dark history he was beginning to uncover. He spoke of hope, of renewal, of the sacred duty to bring light to dark places. For 10 years, he preached, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his flock. That house on the edge of our neighborhood has been a symbol of what was taken from us. It has been a place of shadows, of fear. The city has forgotten it, has allowed it to rot. But we will not forget. We will not allow a place of such pain to remain in our midst. This Saturday, we are going to come together, as a church, as a community, and we are going to reclaim that ground. We are going to clear the darkness and let the light back in. His sermon was a spark in a room full of dry tinder. The idea of taking direct, physical action, of confronting the source of their fear head-on, was a powerful, galvanizing force. The community, which had been forced into a state of passive, silent mourning for a decade, was suddenly activated, energized by a shared, tangible purpose. That Saturday morning, the street in front of the Abramson house was transformed. It was no longer a quiet, dead-end road, but a bustling, vibrant hub of activity. Nearly 100 people from the neighborhood arrived, armed with tools and a fierce, determined spirit. Men with chainsaws and machetes formed a line to attack the overgrown yard. Women set up folding tables, creating a makeshift command center with coolers of water and plates of sandwiches. Teenagers, who had grown up with the house as a forbidden, terrifying bogeyman, now attacked the overgrown weeds with a joyful, fearless energy. The air was filled with the sounds of a community taking its power back. The roar of the chainsaws, the scrape of rakes against the hard-packed dirt, the sound of neighbors laughing and working together. It was a symphony of renewal, a loud, a defiant statement that they would no longer be defined by their fear. They were not waiting for the city to save them. They were saving themselves. Pastor Miles moved through the scene, his heart filled with a profound sense of awe and pride. He was witnessing the resurrection of a community's spirit. They worked with a relentless, focused energy, tearing away at the tangled mess that had hidden the house for so long. They were clearing the physical space, but they were also clearing a space in their own hearts, a space for healing, for hope, for the possibility of a future that was not defined by the ghosts of the past. It was a beautiful, powerful, and deeply hopeful act of defiance, and none of them knew that it was about to lead them to a discovery that would plunge them back into the very heart of the darkness they were trying so hard to clear away. The progress was astonishing. By midday, the yard of the Abramson house was almost unrecognizable. The suffocating jungle of kudzu and saw palmetto had been hacked away, revealing the crumbling foundation and the peeling gray wood of the house itself. The property, once a wild, menacing presence, now looked small, pathetic, and exposed under the bright, unforgiving Florida Sunday. The community's collective effort was a visible triumph, a testament to what they could achieve when they worked together. They had tamed the wilderness. But as they cleared the final, thickest section of growth at the back of the house, they discovered that the true wilderness was not in the yard, but beneath it. A team of men, led by the church's burly head deacon, Samuel, was working to clear a dense, stubborn wall of English ivy that had completely engulfed the rear foundation. The ivy was ancient, its vines as thick as a man's wrist, and it took their combined strength, using machetes and axes, to tear it away from the cinder blocks. As they pulled away the last thick carpet of green, one of the men stopped, his axe frozen in mid-swing. "Hold on a minute," he said, his voice a low, curious grunt. "What in the world is that?" Tucked into a recess in the foundation, almost perfectly camouflaged by the shadows, was a feature that was clearly not part of the house's original design. It was a low, rectangular concrete frame, and set within it was a heavy, flat sheet of corrugated metal, its surface a uniform, pitted blanket of dark red rust. It was a basement hatch, but it was in the wrong place. The house's original cellar entrance was a traditional, sloped door on the side of the building. This was something else. Something that had been deliberately hidden, its location chosen for its inaccessibility, its existence meant to be a secret. A tense, curious silence fell over the work crew. The sounds of the other volunteers in the front yard, the distant chatter and laughter, seemed to fade away. All focus was now on this strange, unexpected discovery. Pastor Miles was called over, and he stood with the other men, staring down at the rusted metal hatch. The house, which they had thought they had finally exposed, seemed to be revealing a new, deeper and more sinister layer of its anatomy. The hatch was not padlocked, but it was sealed by a decade of rust and the compacted weight of the dirt and debris that had been washed over it. It was clear it hadn't been opened in a very, very long time. It took the combined effort of 4 men, using the sharp, flat edges of their shovels as crowbars, to break the seal. With a loud, groaning, metallic shriek of protest, the heavy metal sheet lifted, its rusted hinges snapping under the strain. They heaved it to the side, revealing a dark, square opening in the earth. A wave of cool, stale air, the captured, unbreathing atmosphere of a long-sealed space, washed over them. It was a smell of deep, damp earth, of mildew, and of a faint, almost imperceptible undertone that was both acrid and faintly sweet. They peered into the darkness, but their eyes, accustomed to the bright sunlight, could see nothing but the top few rungs of a crude, wooden ladder that descended into the black, silent void below. The house had been breached, and the men standing at the edge of that dark, waiting opening knew, with a shared, unspoken, and terrifying certainty, that they had to go down. The decision was made without a word. The discovery of the hidden hatch had changed the nature of their work from a community service project into a grim, necessary investigation. Pastor David Miles, as the leader, knew he had to be the first to descend. He retrieved a large, powerful flashlight from his truck, its heavy, metallic weight a small comfort in his hand. He took a deep breath, offered a silent prayer, and swung his legs over the edge of the opening, his work boots finding the top rung of the wooden ladder. The descent was a journey into another world. The bright, humid air of the Florida afternoon was instantly replaced by a cool, damp, and heavy stillness. The sounds of the world above, the distant traffic, the chirping of birds, the voices of the cleanup crew faded away, replaced by the sound of his own breathing and the soft, scraping sound of his boots on the wooden rungs. The smell of damp earth and decay was overpowering, the smell of a place that had not breathed fresh air in a very, very long time. He reached the bottom, his feet landing on a hard-packed dirt floor. He was followed by Samuel, the deacon, and James, a younger, stronger member of the church, their combined presence a small island of courage in the vast, oppressive darkness. They clicked on their own flashlights, and the 3 beams began to cut nervous, exploratory paths through the gloom. They were in a small, unfinished basement, its walls a rough, uneven surface of exposed cinder blocks. The space was a chaotic, claustrophobic junkyard, a physical manifestation of a disordered and forgotten life. A rust-eaten mattress, its springs bursting through the stained ticking, was propped against one wall. Stacks of yellowed, water-damaged magazines and books were slowly decomposing into a soft, pulpy mass. Broken lawn furniture, empty bottles, and a thick, uniform layer of dust and cobwebs covered everything. It was a scene of mundane, pathetic squalor, not of calculated evil. For a moment, a sense of anticlimax settled over the pastor. Perhaps this was just a root cellar, a place where a reclusive, paranoid man had stored supplies. Perhaps the strangeness of it all was just in his own mind, his imagination running wild. He began a slow, methodical sweep of the space, his beam probing the dark corners, half expecting to find nothing more than rats and spiders. And then, James, who was exploring the far wall, a solid expanse of cinder blocks, stopped dead. His flashlight beam was fixed on one spot. "Pastor," he said, his voice a low, tight whisper that was swallowed by the thick, silent air. "You need to see this." Pastor Miles and Samuel moved to his side, their own beams converging on the spot James had illuminated. And there it was. It was a door. A new, solid, windowless wood door, set directly into the cinder block wall. It was shockingly, impossibly out of place. Its clean lines, its fresh varnish, its modern, heavy-duty deadbolt and hasp were a stark, jarring contrast to the surrounding decay. This was not a part of the house's original structure. This was a recent, deliberate, and professional addition. And it was secured with a thick, heavy-duty padlock, its brass surface gleaming in their flashlight beams, a single, malevolent, golden eye in the darkness. The feeling of anticlimax vanished, replaced by a pure, cold, and absolute dread. This was no storage closet. This was a cell, a room that was not supposed to be there. And they knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that the answers they were searching for were on the other side of that lock. The discovery of the secret padlocked door transformed the atmosphere in the basement from one of cautious exploration to one of high, unbearable tension. The three men stood before it, their flashlights trained on the gleaming brass padlock, the single unblinking eye of the house's deepest secret. The air was thick and heavy, and the silence seemed to press in on them, amplifying the sound of their own ragged breathing. "We have to get in there," Samuel, the deacon, stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was less a suggestion and more a declaration of unavoidable fact. He was a man of action, a construction worker who understood the brutal logic of force and leverage. He looked at the lock not with fear, but with a professional's cold, appraising eye. James, the youngest of the three, was sent scrambling back up the ladder into the bright sunlit world above, which now felt a universe away. He returned moments later, his face grim, carrying a pair of long-handled industrial-grade bolt cutters. The tool, with its sharpened, heavy-duty steel jaws, felt impossibly modern, impossibly brutal. In the ancient, decaying basement, it was a key forged not of brass and tumblers, but of pure, unadulterated force. Samuel took the bolt cutters, the weight of them familiar in his large, capable hands. He stepped up to the door and positioned the tool's powerful jaws around the thick, hardened steel shackle of the padlock. For a long, pregnant moment, he paused. The three men exchanged a final, silent, knowing look. They were about to cross a line, to breach a barrier that had been deliberately and violently sealed. They all knew, with a shared, primal instinct, that there was no going back from what they were about to do. Whatever was on the other side of this door would change them, and their community, forever. Pastor Miles gave a single, solemn, almost imperceptible nod. Samuel took a deep breath and squeezed the long, rubber-coated handles. The muscles in his forearms and shoulders bunched with the effort. There was a low, metallic groan as the sharpened steel began to bite into the padlock's shackle. He squeezed harder, his knuckles turning white, putting the full force of his body into the tool. The sound, when it came, was not a groan, but a single, shocking, explosive crack that echoed through the silent basement like a rifle shot. The severed shackle of the padlock sprang apart, and the lock itself fell to the hard-packed dirt floor with a soft, almost apologetic thud. The final seal was broken. James reached out a hand that was not quite steady and pulled on the doorknob. The heavy, solid wood door swung inward without a sound, its new, well-oiled hinges moving with a smooth, silent, and deeply sinister ease. A wave of air, different from the damp, musty air of the main basement, rolled out of the dark, waiting opening. It was a dry, old, and sterile smell, the scent of dust, of cold, faint metal, and of something else, something indefinable, but something that was deeply, fundamentally, and horribly wrong. They stood frozen at the threshold, their flashlights piercing the absolute darkness beyond, on the verge of finally entering the heart of a 10-year-old nightmare. Pastor David Miles was the first to cross the threshold, his flashlight beam cutting a shaky, uncertain path through the pitch-black void of the hidden room. The space was small and windowless, a perfect, concrete-lined box. The beam landed first on the wall to his left, and the sight that met his eyes was so mundane, so innocent, and so utterly, heartbreakingly tragic that it stole the breath from his lungs and replaced it with a block of ice. lined up neatly against the bare concrete wall, as if in a ghostly spectral bicycle rack, were 5 small children's bikes. They were arranged with a chilling, meticulous precision. From a small red tricycle with faded white tassels on its handlebars, to a slightly larger girl's bike with a basket on the front, to a blue BMX-style bike that still had a Power Rangers sticker peeling from its central frame. They were the iconic, brightly colored vessels of childhood freedom, each one a silent, heartbreaking testament to a life of summer days, of scraped knees, of the pure, unadulterated joy of being a kid. They were also the first, irrefutable, and soul-crushing piece of proof that the 5 missing children of Riverwood had been in this room. As Samuel and James crowded in behind him, their own flashlight beams joining his, the full, horrifying diorama of the room was revealed. This was not a storage room, it was a gallery, a museum of stolen lives. The flashlight beams swept past the bicycles to a set of rough, unpainted wooden shelves that had been bolted to the far wall. And on these shelves, arranged with the obsessive, curated order of a collector, were the personal, intimate belongings of the missing children. The beams illuminated a single, scuffed-up red sneaker, its laces gone. Beside it sat a well-worn, leather baseball glove, its pocket still holding the faint, round memory of a baseball. There was a small, plastic-wrapped library book, its title, The Amazing World of Science, a gut-wrenching reminder of Tiana's passion. And on the top shelf, sitting alone like a holy relic in a profane temple, was a blue and red backpack, the Power Rangers logo on its front, faded and cracked with age. Pastor Miles recognized it instantly from the faded, sun-bleached photograph that was still tied to the lamppost on Jackson Street. It was Marcus's backpack. The room was a meticulously arranged, deeply personal archive of stolen childhoods. Each object, so ordinary and so innocent in any other context, was transformed in this dark, silent space into a symbol of a profound and unimaginable loss. The air in the room was thick and still, heavy with the weight of these objects, with the stories they told. This was not the random collection of a hoarder. This was the curated gallery of a predator, a place where the trophies of his unspeakable acts were kept, preserved, and perhaps revisited and admired. The 3 men stood in a stunned, horrified silence, their flashlight beams moving slowly from bicycle to backpack, from sneaker to book, each new discovery another sharp physical blow to the heart. The official stories, the convenient, dismissive narratives of a police force that had refused to see, were not just lies. They were a grotesque, insulting desecration of the truth that was now so clearly, so heartbreakingly, laid out before them in this dark, hidden room. The children had not left. They had been taken, and this room, this collection, was the first part of the final terrible answer. After the initial, overwhelming shock of the bicycles and the shelves had washed over them, a new, more focused, and even more terrifying kind of dread began to settle into the small, cold room. The collection of stolen belongings was horrifying, a clear and undeniable link to the 5 missing children, but it was also, in a strange and deeply unsettling way, a distraction. As Pastor Miles slowly swept the beam of his flashlight away from the heartbreakingly familiar objects on the shelves, away from the tragic reminders of the lives that had been stolen, he realized that the room had a clear, deliberate focal point, a centerpiece that he had, in the first moments of shock, completely overlooked. In the exact, geometric center of the room, placed with the cold, intentional precision of a precious artifact in a museum exhibit, sat a single, small, wooden crate. It was an old, weathered apple crate, its wood a pale, splintered gray, its corners worn smooth with age. It sat all alone on the cold, bare concrete floor, a clear, almost reverent space of several feet around it on all sides, a placement that commanded attention, that demanded to be seen as the most important object in the room. This was different from the other items. The bicycles were lined up against a wall. The personal effects were arranged on shelves. They were a collection. The crate, in its stark, central isolation, was an altar. It was a presentation. The horror in the room, which had been a diffuse, atmospheric dread, now contracted, tightening like a knot in the pit of his stomach into a single, sharp, and almost unbearable point of focus. The three men, as if pulled by an invisible, unspoken force, slowly, hesitantly, moved towards it. Their three flashlight beams, which had been sweeping the room, now converged on the small, unassuming wooden box. The rest of the room, with its tragic display of stolen childhoods, seemed to fade into the peripheral darkness. The entire world had shrunk to the dimensions of this single wooden crate and whatever terrible final secret it held. There was nothing overtly menacing about the crate itself. It was just a box, old and weathered. But its placement, its deliberate isolation, its undeniable role as the centerpiece of this horrifying museum of loss, filled it with a profound, almost gravitational sense of malice. It was the dark, still, silent heart of the room. It was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the object that held the ultimate, unspoken truth of what had happened here. Pastor Miles felt a cold, primal, and deeply instinctual fear grip him, a feeling so intense it was almost paralyzing. A part of him, the rational, hopeful part of his soul that still desperately clung to the possibility of some less monstrous explanation, did not want to see what was on that crate. He wanted to turn, to flee up the ladder, to leave this terrible place and its secrets buried in the dark forever. But he knew he couldn't. He had come this far. The community, the families, the ghosts of the children themselves were counting on him. He took a final, steadying breath, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly, and took the last few steps, his flashlight beam held tight and steady on the top of the crate, on the one, small, final object that sat there, waiting in the absolute, patient, and eternal darkness. The beam of Pastor Miles's flashlight landed squarely on the object sitting atop the crate, and for a long, surreal, and deeply confusing moment, his mind struggled to process the image. It was a small, pale, and vaguely round object, its surface a smooth, yellowish white in the harsh, clinical glare of the artificial light. His first, rational, and deeply hopeful thought was that it was a model, a teaching tool. It looked almost exactly like the kind of detailed, plastic anatomical model he remembered from his high school biology class, the kind the teacher would use to demonstrate the intricacies of the human body. It was a strange, macabre, and deeply unsettling thing to find in a place like this, but it was still, in his mind, just an object, a harmless, if creepy, piece of plastic. He took another, hesitant step closer, his scientific curiosity at war with a deep, primal revulsion that was rising in his throat. He leaned in, the beam of his flashlight tightening on the object, his focus absolute. And that's when he saw the details. The small, intimate, and horrifyingly real details that no plastic model would ever have. He saw the tiny, thread-like, zigzagging lines that traced a delicate, irregular path across its surface. They were the sutures, he realized with a jolt of anatomical memory, the places where the separate, soft plates of a child's bone had slowly, miraculously, fused together in the first years of life. His light moved slightly, and he saw a small hairline fracture, a dark, spidery, and undeniably authentic crack just above the left eye socket. It was an imperfection, a flaw that was too real, too random, for any manufactured, mass-produced model. His blood ran cold, his breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful hitch. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, unbreathable. His trembling flashlight beam moved lower, tracing the curve of the jawline, and then he saw the gap. A small, square, and unmistakable gap in the upper row of tiny teeth. It was the precise, telltale space left behind when a baby tooth has been lost and the new, permanent tooth has not yet descended. He thought, with a sudden, soul-crushing wave of absolute certainty, of the gap-toothed, 9-year-old smile of Marcus, the first child to disappear, his faded photograph from the lamppost memorial now burned forever into the pastor's memory. He realized, with a dawning, absolute, and world-shattering horror, that it wasn't plastic. The object on the crate was not a model. It was not a symbol. It was a remnant. It was the final, irrefutable, and unspeakably profane piece of the puzzle. The horror of the moment was not in a gruesome, graphic, or bloody display. It was in the quiet, clinical, and devastatingly intimate realization of what this small, pale object truly was. It was the final, horrifying answer to the question that had haunted Riverwood for a decade. What had become of its children? Pastor Miles stumbled back, a choked, guttural, and inhuman sound escaping his throat. He bumped hard into Samuel, who grabbed his arms to steady him, his own face a mask of pale, stunned disbelief. The three men stood frozen, their flashlight beams still fixed on the object, the terrible, silent truth now hanging in the cold, still air between them. The room was not just a collection of belongings. It was a tomb, and the object on the crate was its single, horrifying, and undeniable headstone. There were no screams in the moments following the discovery. There was only a profound, crushing, and absolute silence. A silence that seemed to suck all the air, all the warmth, all the hope from the small, cold room. The three men, Pastor Miles, Samuel, and James, stood like statues carved from ice, their bodies rigid with a horror that was too deep, too fundamental for words. The beams of their flashlights, which had been so active and searching just moments before, were now held in a state of paralyzed, unblinking shock, fixed on the small, terrible object that sat in the center of the room. The verdict had been delivered. It was a verdict more final, more absolute than any that could ever be handed down in a court of law. The children of Riverwood had not been the victims of some vague, internal, community violence. They had not been taken in tragic but explainable custody disputes. They had been brought to this house, to this dark, hidden, and meticulously arranged room, where a terrible, final, and unimaginable fate had awaited them. The official narratives, the easy, dismissive stories that had allowed a city to forget, to look away, to blame the victims for their own suffering, were not just lies. They were a profound, systemic, and unforgivable injustice. This room was the truth. It was the silent, screaming testimony of the victims themselves, told through the heartbreaking collection of their stolen childhoods, and the final, unspeakable proof of what had become of them. The indifference of a police force that wouldn't listen, the apathy of a city that wouldn't see it had all led to this. It had allowed a monster to operate, to hunt, to collect, to build this horrifying monument to his crimes. For a decade, completely undisturbed in a house that stood in plain sight, Pastor Miles felt a wave of nausea, so profound it buckled his knees, and a cold, righteous fury, so intense it felt like fire in his veins. He thought of Mrs. Loretta, of her pained, frustrated, and prophetic voice telling him, "They never listened to us. She had been right. She had tried to warn them, to point them to this very house, to the strange, watchful man in the window, and she had been dismissed, her fears invalidated by a system that had already decided where the blame should lie. The entire community had been dismissed. And this room, this collection of horrors, was the direct, inevitable, and unforgivable result of that dismissal. Slowly, as if waking from a long, terrible trance, Pastor Miles lowered his flashlight, the beam falling to the dusty concrete floor. He backed out of the room, his movements stiff, robotic. "Don't touch anything else," he said, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable whisper that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of his soul. "We have to call the police. Now." He turned and led the other two men, who were still locked in a state of stunned, silent shock, out of the hidden room. He pulled the heavy, solid wood door shut, closing the darkness and its terrible secret back inside. For now, they ascended the ladder, climbing out of the dust and the decay and back into the warm, sunlit air of the world above. But the world had changed. The air felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, harsher. They had gone down into the basement as hopeful community volunteers, as men seeking to heal a neighborhood wound. They had come back up as the witnesses to a decade of unimaginable horror, the sole bearers of a terrible, explosive truth that would shatter their community all over again before it could ever begin to truly heal. The arrival of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office was not a quiet affair. It was a sudden, overwhelming invasion, a stark and jarring contrast to the dismissive, token encounters the families of Riverwood had endured for a decade. This time, there was no skepticism, no tired indifference. Pastor Miles's 911 call, with its calm, steady, and chillingly precise description of what they had found in the hidden basement room, had triggered a full-scale, multi-agency response that had descended on the small, quiet neighborhood with the force of a thunderclap. The Abramson house, once a forgotten, blighted property on the edge of the community, was now the epicenter of one of the most significant and horrifying criminal investigations in the city's long and troubled history. The house was sealed, transformed overnight into a massive, self-contained crime scene, the yellow police tape a bright, brutal slash against the familiar landscape. The community, which had gathered that morning in a spirit of hopeful renewal, now stood in stunned, silent clusters at the edge of the police cordon, their earlier hope replaced by a dawning, collective horror as the terrible truth of what had been hidden in their midst began to unfold. The initial mystery, the 10-year-old question of what had happened to the children of Riverwood, was solved. The silent, terrible verdict that had been delivered in the darkness of that basement room was now being confirmed by the grim, methodical work of the forensic investigators in their sterile white Tyvek suits. But the resolution of that old, cold, and painful mystery had given birth to a new, urgent, and all-consuming one. Where was Arthur Abramson? The cold cases of 5 missing children were now officially and publicly linked, reopened, and merged into a single, active, and high-priority manhunt. The name and face of the reclusive, strange man who had lived in that house for years were now broadcast on every television station, printed in every newspaper. A ghost suddenly given a name and a horrifying substance. He was no longer a forgotten neighborhood eccentric. He was one of the most wanted fugitives in the country. Detectives, now armed with a clear suspect and a horrifying motive, began the painstaking process of trying to build a profile of a man who had lived his life as a shadow. They learned he had been a low-wage clerical worker, a man with no known family, no friends, and no social footprint. He had paid his bills in cash, lived a life almost entirely off the grid, and had simply vanished in 2005, his disappearance as quiet and as unnoticed by the authorities as his victims. The focus of the story, and of the city, shifted with a whiplash intensity from the quiet, long-suffering grief of the past to the urgent, active, and public pursuit of justice for the future. Pastor David Miles, the quiet, determined man of faith who had simply wanted to clean up a neighborhood eyesore, found himself at the center of the storm. He was hailed as a hero by the media, but he felt only the heavy, crushing weight of the truth he had been forced to uncover. He became the community's voice, their advocate, their spiritual anchor, working with the shattered families, with the now attentive police, ensuring that this time their story would be heard, that this time the system would not, could not, fail them. The story of Riverwood was no longer just about the loss. It was now about the hunt. The discovery in the basement was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the start of a new, desperate, and nationwide search for the man who had built that room of horrors, a man who had been allowed to operate with impunity, a monster who had, for 10 long years, been protected by the silence and the willful, unforgivable blindness of the very system that should have stopped him.